The theological architecture was perfect. If you obeyed and still suffered, it meant the gods were testing you. If you resisted and suffered more, it proved that disobedience brought punishment. There was no scenario in which the system itself could be questioned. Every outcome confirmed its validity. And so she obeyed. They all did, because the alternative was not just punishment in this life, but punishment forever. An eternity of suffering that made these years seem merciful by comparison. The threat of eternal damnation is the ultimate control mechanism. It extends consequences beyond the limit of human endurance, beyond death itself, into an infinite future of pain. No temporary rebellion is worth permanent agony. No moment of freedom is worth losing your soul. This is what made temple authority absolute, in a way that mere political power never could be. A king could imprison your body. A temple could imprison your eternity. And when people believe in that eternity, when they truly accept that their choices in this brief life determine their fate forever, they will endure almost anything rather than risk divine anger. Fear is effective, but fear paired with faith is absolute. The temple did not function in isolation. It was part of a larger system, an economy built on devotion. Families donated land in exchange for blessings. Merchants paid for ceremonies that would bring prosperity. The wealthy funded new shrines to demonstrate piety and secure favor. Kings granted temples tax exemptions and legal immunity in exchange for political legitimacy. Every layer of society was bound to the temple through transactions that were presented as spiritual but functioned as economic. The temple collected tithes from every harvest, fees for weddings, births, deaths, payments for prayers, offerings for intercession. The more desperate the need, the higher the cost. A farmer whose crops failed paid for rituals to restore divine favor. A woman unable to conceive paid for blessings. A merchant facing bankruptcy paid for ceremonies to change his fortune. The temple profited from every crisis, every fear, every hope. And because these transactions were framed as religious rather than commercial, they could not be negotiated or refused. To question the price of a blessing was to question the gods themselves. To refuse payment was to invite the very catastrophe you were trying to avoid. The girls were part of this economy. Their labor maintained the temple. Their presence attracted donations. Their very existence proved that the temple had power, that it could demand sacrifice and receive it willingly. They worked without wages. They produced without ownership. They served without compensation. Everything they made, everything they did, flowed upward, to the priests, to the authorities, to the institution itself. They were simultaneously the temple's labor force, its proof of divine authority, and its most profitable product. Families paid to dedicate daughters. Visitors paid to witness ceremonies performed by these devoted servants. The wealthy paid for private blessings delivered by girls whose purity, it was said, made their prayers more effective.
The family arrived at the temple before sunrise. The ceremony had to be completed in darkness. The girl wore white. Her hair, which had been long, was cut in the courtyard. Each strand removed was a severance, from childhood, from choice, from the future she might have imagined. The priests chanted in a language she did not understand. They marked her forehead with ash and oil. They gave her a new name. The name her parents chose for her was no longer hers to carry. She was reborn, they said, born into service, born into the divine. Her mother did not look at her as they left. To look would be to acknowledge what was happening, and acknowledgement would require a response. Grief, perhaps, regret, questions that could not be asked. So she walked forward, eyes ahead, hands folded, because to falter even for a moment would suggest that the gods had made a mistake, that the temple had demanded something wrong, that devotion could, in fact, be questioned. And that was impossible. The girl learned quickly that her life was no longer hers. Every hour was assigned, every action prescribed. She woke before dawn to the sound of bells, cold water, stone floors. The other girls moved in silence through the dim corridors. Speaking was discouraged. Laughter was forbidden. Her days were filled with ritual, cleaning the shrines, preparing offerings, learning prayers that stretched for hours. Her hands bled from scrubbing floors, her knees bruised from kneeling, but pain was part of devotion, they told her, proof that the gods were pleased. She was watched constantly by the older women who had been there for decades, by the younger priests who walked the halls, by the temple authorities who appeared without warning, checking, inspecting, ensuring obedience. There were rules for everything: how to walk, how to sit, how to lower your eyes, how to speak if you were permitted to speak at all, how to move through space without taking up too much of it, how to exist without existing. The public saw something else entirely. On festival days, she stood at the temple entrance in ceremonial dress, flowers in her hair, gold on her wrists. The crowd bowed as she passed. They called her blessed, chosen by the gods. They believed she lived a life of peace and prayer, removed from the struggles of ordinary existence. They did not see what happened when the doors closed, the ceremonies that lasted until her legs trembled, the fasts that went on for days, the punishments for infractions so small they barely qualified as mistakes, a glance held too long, a word spoken out of turn, a moment of hesitation during prayer.
Publicly revered, privately controlled. This was the paradox of sacred service. The closer you appeared to the divine, the less human you were allowed to be. She learned not to cry. Tears were evidence of attachment to the material world. They suggested she was not fully devoted, that part of her remained outside the temple, that she still wanted something beyond what the gods required. So she stopped crying. She stopped wanting, or at least she learned to bury wanting so deep that it looked like peace. The psychology of it was precise, elegant even in its cruelty. When suffering is framed as divine will, resistance becomes impossible, because to resist the suffering is to resist the gods, and to resist the gods is to risk everything you've been taught to fear: damnation, exile, the severing of your soul. Guilt became the instrument of compliance. Any moment of doubt was proof of spiritual weakness. Any desire for something different was evidence of corruption. The more you struggled, the more you confirmed your need for discipline, for correction, for more suffering, which would, they promised, eventually purify you. This is how control functions when it is cloaked in the sacred. It turns your own conscience against you. It makes you complicit in your own captivity. Because if this is the will of the gods, then to want freedom is to want sin. The mechanism is elegant in its cruelty. Every impulse toward resistance becomes evidence of spiritual corruption. Every moment of doubt confirms your need for deeper discipline. The system convinces you that your suffering is not imposed from outside, but generated from within, from your own inadequacy, your own failure to achieve true devotion. And so you police yourself more brutally than any external authority ever could. When a girl feels exhaustion after 14 hours of ritual labor, she does not blame the institution that demands it. She blames her weak flesh. When she longs for her mother, for sunlight, for a life beyond these walls, she does not question why such natural desires have been forbidden. She questions herself. Why am I not grateful? Why am I not pure enough to accept this willingly? What is wrong with me that I still want things the gods have declared unnecessary? The guilt becomes self-sustaining. It requires no external enforcement once it has been properly installed. The girl becomes her own jailer, her own interrogator, her own judge, and the verdict is always insufficient, not devoted enough, not worthy, not yet purified. Obedience was not just required, it was salvation. The only path to divine favor, the only way to ensure that your next life, if there was one, would be better than this. This promise that suffering now would be rewarded later kept the system functioning across generations. It transformed unbearable circumstances into spiritual investment. Every humiliation became a deposit in an account that would pay dividends after death. Every loss was framed as a test that, if passed, would prove your worthiness for heaven. The theological architecture was perfect. If you obeyed and still suffered, it meant the gods were testing you. If you resisted and suffered more, it proved that disobedience brought punishment. There was no scenario in which the system itself could be questioned. Every outcome confirmed its validity. And so she obeyed. They all did, because the alternative was not just punishment in this life, but punishment forever. An eternity of suffering that made these years seem merciful by comparison. The threat of eternal damnation is the ultimate control mechanism. It extends consequences beyond the limit of human endurance, beyond death itself, into an infinite future of pain. No temporary rebellion is worth permanent agony. No moment of freedom is worth losing your soul. This is what made temple authority absolute, in a way that mere political power never could be. A king could imprison your body. A temple could imprison your eternity. And when people believe in that eternity, when they truly accept that their choices in this brief life determine their fate forever, they will endure almost anything rather than risk divine anger. Fear is effective, but fear paired with faith is absolute. The temple did not function in isolation. It was part of a larger system, an economy built on devotion. Families donated land in exchange for blessings. Merchants paid for ceremonies that would bring prosperity. The wealthy funded new shrines to demonstrate piety and secure favor. Kings granted temples tax exemptions and legal immunity in exchange for political legitimacy. Every layer of society was bound to the temple through transactions that were presented as spiritual but functioned as economic. The temple collected tithes from every harvest, fees for weddings, births, deaths, payments for prayers, offerings for intercession. The more desperate the need, the higher the cost. A farmer whose crops failed paid for rituals to restore divine favor. A woman unable to conceive paid for blessings. A merchant facing bankruptcy paid for ceremonies to change his fortune. The temple profited from every crisis, every fear, every hope. And because these transactions were framed as religious rather than commercial, they could not be negotiated or refused. To question the price of a blessing was to question the gods themselves. To refuse payment was to invite the very catastrophe you were trying to avoid. The girls were part of this economy. Their labor maintained the temple. Their presence attracted donations. Their very existence proved that the temple had power, that it could demand sacrifice and receive it willingly. They worked without wages. They produced without ownership. They served without compensation. Everything they made, everything they did, flowed upward, to the priests, to the authorities, to the institution itself. They were simultaneously the temple's labor force, its proof of divine authority, and its most profitable product. Families paid to dedicate daughters. Visitors paid to witness ceremonies performed by these devoted servants. The wealthy paid for private blessings delivered by girls whose purity, it was said, made their prayers more effective.
But the institution did not exist to serve them. It existed to perpetuate itself, to maintain its power, to expand its influence. And it did this by convincing families that giving away their daughters was an honor, that poverty was a test, that obedience was the only virtue that mattered. The system's genius lay in its ability to make exploitation look like opportunity. A poor family was not abandoning a daughter they could not afford to keep. They were granting her access to the divine. A girl was not being imprisoned, she was being elevated above ordinary existence. Loss was reframed as gain. Captivity was reframed as privilege. Who benefited from this system? Not the gods. Gods do not need temples. They do not need gold or land or power. They do not need children scrubbing floors until their hands crack and bleed. The people who needed these things were human. Priests who lived in comfort while the dedicated slept on stone. Authorities who accumulated wealth while the devoted fasted. Institutions
institutions that grew larger with each generation, while the girls inside them disappeared into roles that erased their names, their histories, their futures. The economy of the sacred was never about serving the divine, it was about serving power. And power, throughout history, has always found ways to make its demands sound holy. The people who needed these things were human, priests who lived in comfort while the dedicated slept on stone, authorities who accumulated wealth while the devoted fasted, institutions that grew larger with each generation while the girls inside them disappeared into roles that erased their names, their histories, their futures. The economy of the sacred was never about serving the divine, it was about serving power. And power, throughout history, has always found ways to make its demands sound holy. The priests ate meat while the girls ate rice and lentils. They wore silk while the girls wore coarse cotton that abraded skin. Their quarters had windows that opened to gardens. The girls slept in narrow cells where dampness crept up the walls and winter cold settled in bones. The contrast was not accidental, it was structural, designed, a hierarchy made visible through every material detail. The economy of devotion was simple: extract labor, frame it as salvation, punish any hesitation as spiritual failure, collect the profits, repeat. There was nothing complex about it once you stripped away the sacred language. It was extraction dressed in ritual, the same mechanism that drove every exploitative system throughout history, but more effective because it weaponized the divine. Workers could strike, servants could flee, but the devoted could only obey. Their contract was not with an employer, but with eternity itself. And because it was all done in the name of the divine, questioning it felt like blasphemy. To ask who benefits was to suggest that the system was built on something other than faith, that it served human interests rather than heavenly ones.
The question itself became dangerous, not because the answer was unclear, but because it was too clear. Follow the wealth, follow the power, follow who eats and who starves, who speaks and who stays silent, who accumulates and who loses everything. The pattern reveals itself immediately to anyone willing to look. But looking required courage most people did not have, because once you saw the system clearly, you could not unsee it, and unseeing it meant living with knowledge that demanded response, action, resistance, things that carried consequences most families could not afford. Most people did not ask. Asking was dangerous. Asking led to answers that could not be unlearned. So they continued, generation after generation. Girls walked through temple doors and did not come back out. Families consoled themselves with the belief that their daughters were serving a higher purpose. The temples grew wealthier, the authorities grew more powerful. The system perpetuated itself through collective willful blindness. Each family told themselves that their daughter was different, that she was chosen, that she wanted this, that the gods had called her specifically. They did not gather with other families to compare experiences, to notice the pattern, to see that every temple in every region was filled with girls who had all been chosen in exactly the same way. And the girls inside learned to stop asking questions, because the answers, when they came, were always the same. This is the will of the gods. This is your destiny. This is devotion. The first time she asked why, she was 12. Why couldn't she see her family? The answer came with a slap across her face and 3 days of fasting. The second time, she was 14. Why did the priests live differently than the devoted? She spent a week in isolation praying for forgiveness for her corrupted thoughts. By the time she was 16, she had learned that questions led only to punishment. So she stopped asking, stopped wondering, stopped allowing her mind to reach toward anything that might destabilize her fragile acceptance.
The cost was paid in lives that never began, futures that were decided before they could be imagined, women who never married, never had children, never chose a path for themselves. She would never know what kind of woman she might have become, what work would have called to her, what person she might have loved, what children she might have raised, what life she might have built with her own hands according to her own vision. All of that existed only as absence, a ghost future that haunted the edges of her awareness. She turned 16 inside the temple walls, then 20, then 25. The years moved differently there. Without seasons, without change, time became something that happened to other people, outside, in the world she no longer belonged to.
Every day was identical to the one before. The same bells, the same prayers, the same stone floors and cold water and rules that never shifted. Time lost its forward motion. It became circular, repetitive, a loop that played endlessly without variation or crescendo. Her family visited once. Her mother, older now, face carved by years of labor. They stood in the courtyard, separated by more than distance, by the choices that had been made before either of them could speak. Her mother brought fruit. The temple did not allow her to accept it. Rules about offerings, about attachment. They looked at each other across the space between them. Her mother's eyes carried something, guilt perhaps, or grief carefully controlled, or perhaps just exhaustion. The exhaustion of a woman who had survived by not looking too closely at what survival required. The girl wanted to ask, "Do you think of me? Do you wonder what I might have been? Do you regret it?" But she said nothing, because what answer could possibly make it bearable? Yes would confirm abandonment. No would confirm erasure. Either way, she would leave the conversation with less than she came with. So they spoke of small things, the weather, the temple gardens. Her mother left, and she returned to the only life she was permitted to have. Time continued its strange, suspended crawl, and she disappeared further into the role that had consumed her name. They spoke briefly. Weather, harvest, safe topics that required no intimacy. Her mother asked if she was happy. She said yes, because what other answer was possible? To say no would require her mother to acknowledge the decision that had brought her here, and that acknowledgement would break something neither of them could afford to break. Her mother left. She did not look back. The girl, no longer a girl, but not quite a woman because women exist in the world and she existed only in the temple, returned to her tasks. She wondered briefly what her life might have looked like. A husband, perhaps, children, a house with windows that opened to the sky. But the wondering was dangerous. It suggested desire, attachment, proof that she was not fully devoted. So she buried it, pushed it down into the place where all forbidden thoughts went, and continued. Some of the older women had been there for 40 years, 50. They moved through the halls like shadows, silent, efficient. Their faces carried no expression. They had learned long ago how to live without living, how to perform devotion so completely that it became indistinguishable from death. This was the true cost, not pain, not suffering, not the physical labor or the endless rituals. The cost was the slow erasure of the self, the gradual disappearance of any identity outside of service, until you could not remember who you were before, until you could not imagine who you might have been. The temple took girls and returned nothing. No alternative, no compensation, no acknowledgement that something had been lost, because loss required value, and these lives, the temple insisted, had been given freely, offered willingly, dedicated out of pure devotion. If they had been offered willingly, then nothing had been taken, And if nothing had been taken, then there was no debt to repay, no accounting, no reckoning. This was the final mechanism of control, erasing the loss by calling it a gift. But gifts can be refused, and these could not. And so the word gift became a lie, one more element in a system built on language that obscured reality. Sacred instead of trapped, blessed instead of controlled, devoted instead of disappeared. She was 32 when the reforms began. Whispers first, then news that traveled slowly through the temple walls. Laws passed in distant cities, restrictions on child dedication, minimum ages, requirements for consent. The older priests resisted. This was tradition, they said. This was sacred. To change it was to insult the gods. To question it was heresy. The reforms would bring divine anger, punishment, catastrophe. But the reforms continued, not because of the priests, because of the women outside the temples, the ones who had escaped, the ones who had been removed by family members who finally acknowledged what was happening, the ones who had survived and decided to speak. They formed groups, small at first, meeting in homes, in courtyards, in spaces where temple authority did not reach. They documented what had been done, recorded names, gathered testimony, built evidence that could not be dismissed or erased. They faced resistance, threats, accusations of blasphemy and betrayal. Some were attacked, some lost their families, their homes, their safety, but they continued because silence had protected the system for too long, and speaking, even when dangerous, was the only way to break it. Activists began to pressure governments, to demand investigations, to expose the economic systems that had sustained temple power for centuries. They called it what it was, not devotion, not tradition, not sacred duty, exploitation, captivity, a system that had consumed generations of girls and called it religion. The temples responded by doubling down, insisting that reform was an attack on faith itself, that those who opposed dedication opposed the gods, that the activists were corrupted by foreign ideas, modern values, secular poison. But the evidence was overwhelming. The testimonies multiplied. The truth became impossible to ignore. Laws were passed, slowly, unevenly. In some regions, dedication was banned entirely. In others, age restrictions were imposed: 16, 18, 21, old enough to consent, old enough to choose. The temples adapted. They found loopholes. They renamed practices. Dedication became voluntary service. Child offerings became spiritual apprenticeships. The language changed. The structure remained. But something had shifted. The absolute authority of the temple had been challenged, and once challenged, it could not be fully restored. Doubt, once introduced, spreads like water through cracks in stone, slowly, inevitably. She was released when she was 38, not freed, released, as if she had been property on loan. She walked through the temple door for the first time in 27 years. The sunlight hurt her eyes. The noise of the street overwhelmed her. She did not know where to go. She had no family that would claim her, no skills beyond prayer and ritual, no concept of how to exist in a world that moved without bells, without chants, without the structure that had defined every moment of her life. She stood outside the temple gates. Free, they had said, but freedom without preparation is just another form of abandonment. She was free to starve, free to beg, free to disappear into a world that had no place for women who had been erased.
Other survivors spoke about the difficulty of after, the way your body remembered how to obey even when your mind wanted to resist, the way you flinched at raised voices, the way you could not sleep without stone beneath you, the way devotion had carved itself so deep that removing it felt like removing your bones. They formed groups, support networks, spaces where women who had survived temple service could speak without judgment, without having to explain. They taught each other how to navigate the world, how to work, how to exist without permission, how to build lives from the fragments that remained. Some married, some did not. Some found purpose, some continued to struggle. There was no single story, no universal recovery. Each woman carried the temple differently. For some, it was a shadow. For others, it was a weight that never lifted. But they spoke, and speaking mattered, because every testimony was evidence, every story was proof. Every survivor who refused to disappear made it harder for the system to continue unquestioned. Modern activism continues. In regions where temple dedication still occurs, groups work to expose it, to document it, to provide legal support for families who want to refuse but fear the consequences, to offer refuge for girls who escape. It is slow work, dangerous work. The systems that benefited from dedication are still powerful, still influential, still capable of punishing those who challenge them. But the silence has been broken, and once broken, it cannot be fully restored. Faith can inspire devotion. This is true. Throughout history, genuine spiritual commitment has led people to acts of profound sacrifice and service. Voluntary dedication exists, real choice exists. Devotion that emerges from conviction rather than coercion is possible. But when authority replaces compassion, sacred spaces can become sites of control. When institutions prioritize their own power over the well-being of those who serve them, devotion becomes indistinguishable from captivity. When children are dedicated before they can consent, faith becomes a mechanism of exploitation. The temples were built with stone and gold and incense, but their real foundation was something else: obedience, fear, the belief that questioning authority was the same as questioning the divine, the conviction that suffering was proof of devotion, the idea that to resist was to sin. These beliefs sustained the system for centuries. They allowed generations of girls to disappear into temple walls without protest. They made erasure look like honor, loss look like blessing, captivity look like choice. But systems built on language eventually collide with reality, and reality is this: no God who is worth worshiping demands the captivity of children. No faith that requires coercion is truly faith. No devotion that cannot be refused is devotion at all. The records show it, the testimonies confirm it, the women who survived it speak it, and their words, however uncomfortable, however challenging to institutional authority, carry a truth that cannot be dismissed. The gods were said to demand sacrifice. The gods were said to require dedication. The gods were said to need young girls locked behind temple walls, scrubbing floors, performing rituals, living lives that were not theirs to live. But history shows something different. History shows it was power that demanded obedience, institutions that required sacrifice, authorities who benefited from systems that consumed lives and called it sacred. The gods, if they spoke at all, did not speak through those who built cages out of incense and called them temples, did not speak through those who took children and called it devotion, did not speak through systems that survived by silencing the voices of those trapped inside them. The truth was always there, in the records that were suppressed, in the testimonies that were dismissed, in the women who escaped and were told they had abandoned their sacred duty, in the families who questioned and were accused of heresy, in the activists who demanded accountability and were called enemies of faith. The truth was there, but it was buried beneath layers of language designed to obscure it. Sacred, blessed, devoted, holy, chosen, words that transformed captivity into honor, that made erasure sound like transcendence, that turned the systematic exploitation of vulnerable populations into religious tradition. And now the truth is spoken, not by institutions, not by those who benefited, but by those who survived, those who refused to let their stories be erased, those who understood that silence protects the system and speaking dismantles it. Their voices are the counter-narrative, the evidence that cannot be dismissed, the testimony that forces a reckoning, not with faith itself, but with the ways faith has been weaponized, used, twisted into a mechanism for control. The temples still stand in some places, smaller now, less powerful, but still standing. And in some of them, the old practices continue under new names. Voluntary, they insist, chosen, sacred service freely given. But the questions have been planted, And questions, once asked, do not disappear. They echo, they spread, they force examination even when examination is resisted. Who benefits? Who consents? Who is protected? And who is sacrificed in the name of the divine? These questions matter. They mattered then, they matter now. Because the systems that consumed those girls did not disappear entirely. They adapted, changed form, found new language, new justifications, new ways to frame exploitation as devotion. And until those systems are fully dismantled, until consent is genuine and choice is real, until no child is dedicated before they can refuse, the story is not over. The woman who was once a girl stands outside the temple gates. She is 50 now. Her hair has grown back, though it is streaked with gray. She looks at the walls that held her, the doors that closed behind her when she was 11, the stones that absorbed her tears, her prayers, her years. She does not go inside. She does not need to. The temple no longer defines her. It shaped her, marked her, left scars that will never fully heal, but it does not own her. She turns away and walks forward, into a life that is hers. Not perfect, not easy, but hers. Behind her, the temple bells ring. The sound follows her down the street, but she does not turn back. She does not flinch. She keeps walking, and the bells, eventually, fade. Stories like this are rarely taught, rarely acknowledged. They exist in the margins of history, in testimonies that were suppressed, in truths that made institutions uncomfortable. If this story mattered to you, if it revealed something you were never told, share it. Let others see what was hidden. Like this video to help it reach those who need to hear it. Subscribe for more histories that refuse to stay buried, because the only way these patterns end is when enough people recognize them, when silence becomes speaking, when erasure becomes memory. The truth was always there.